station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello, and welcome back to another week of Hour of History Cities podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and this week we are moving along in Havana's history. We're going from a period of United States dominance, from that 1898 Civil War between the Cubans and the Spanish, to which the Americans joined in and made the Spanish-American War. We're moving along into a transitional period. The two items this week for focus are the United States dollar and the beard. These two items represent the transition period between an economy dominated by American money and American economic influence and a new political, economic, and social system brought in by Los Barbudos, the bearded ones that come from the Sierra Maestra Mountains. So in order to get from the dollar to the beard, we have to reestablish some of the things we talked about last week. The economy grew greatly in Havana under American influence. There was great expansion along the northern sea coast where the Malecon was built, and giant casinos, mansions, baseball stadiums, and a booming tourist economy turned Havana into a sort of Las Vegas of the Caribbean. But as you might imagine, with the casinos and with the hotels and with the tourists that are so often described with that ugly American stereotype, a lot of problems came as well. Slums grew in the shadows of these casinos, and people started to get angry, get frustrated at these vices that were being thrown throughout Havana. A land that was once described as the Paris of the Caribbean by the Spanish was turned into sort of this middle-class resort town and resort island. And not a lot of Cubans were happy about it. But that wasn't the only issue. A lot of Cubans did really well in Havana. A lot of Cubans made a lot of money and were able to realize this sort of economic dream. So the dollar was a powerful symbol for them, and they were able to experience great economic growth. But it was an unequal economic growth. And one of the problems with that led to this sort of super corrupt governments run by basically mob rulers who would put their favorite politicians, put people who owned casinos in government power, put people who owned hotels in government power, and essentially create laws that could just make them richer at the expense of a lot of the habaneros and at expense of a lot of the Cuban people. In fact, in 1952, President Fulgencio Batista cancels the Constitution and makes himself a dictator. He suspends elections, and he starts embarking on an even greater system of corruption than he had in previous years. So the response to this was not quite positive for Batista. In fact, one of the first people to challenge him was Fidel Castro. So there's a lot that's been said and written about Fidel Castro, certainly in Cuba and the United States. And he's not exactly the focus of Havana, but he has to be brought into the discussion because he is so important to the history of Havana and Cuba. He's actually from Santiago, the son of a Spanish immigrant, but he comes to Havana, goes to the University of Havana, and becomes a lawyer. And in 1953, a year after Batista gets rid of the Constitution, on July 26th, Fidel Castro leads an unsuccessful revolt. He attempts to start this revolt, and it's actually the start of the revolt is in Santiago, so on the other side of Cuba, but he's thrown in jail, he's put on trial, and eventually, after being thrown in prison, he's exiled to Mexico, where he meets Che Guevara and begins a second move towards revolution. Meanwhile, in Havana, much the same is continuing on. So Castro leaves Cuba. He's in Mexico. He begins his revolution from Mexico, comes across to Cuba, and starts the revolution in Santiago and the Sierra Maestra Mountains, which are on the other side of Cuba. Much the same continues to go on in Havana. Life continues the same. Big parties are had. In fact, a lot of people had huge celebrations planned for New Year's Eve 1959, as you might expect in a city like New York City, where lots of people came out to celebrate the new year. But New Year's Eve never happens in Havana in 1959. In fact, Castro and his associates, the people who want to overthrow this corrupt Batista regime, continue to make progress. They land in eastern Cuba in 1956 and begin a guerrilla war that lasts years, really. And it goes from a very small movement, maybe 20 to 80 people, and continues to grow and to grow. So from almost being eliminated entirely from a failed landing, Che Guevara jokes about the ship they take from Mexico. It didn't land in Cuba, it crashed into Cuba. But the fact of the matter is this revolution begins to pick up steam, and Batista and the Habaneros get more and more nervous as time goes. Students begin to uprise. One of the big slogans that comes out of the day in a big poster that's unfurled in La Tropical, a baseball stadium that witnessed some of Havana's greatest games, was the 03C. Zero compra, zero cine, zero cabaret. No buying, no movies, and no cabaret. And this banner is actually unfurled before Fidel even makes it to Havana, but it was a sign of things to come. Students who supported this revolutionary movement and people who were fed up with the corruption of Havana were going to turn life upside down. As early as 1958, nightlife began to slowly start to turn to a trickle in Havana as the revolutionaries approached. Eventually, on New Year's Eve 1959, Batista leaves Cuba. He flees. He sees what's going to happen, and he knows that it's not going to be good for him. So he goes. He goes first to the Dominican Republic. And by January 8th, Fidel Castro arrives in Havana and becomes prime minister. In May, the Cuban government changes the laws of agriculture. They change the laws of basic economics and social systems in Havana. One of the first slogans that Castro and the revolutionaries enact in Havana is "Open your home to a campesino." Open your home to a farmer. When these big celebrations of revolution were happening in Havana, when those who had wealth and those who owned the casinos and the hotels were leaving, much the same way Batista did, taking what they could and getting out before the revolution reckoned with them, the people of Havana were told to open their home to farmers. And indeed, a massive migration happened from the interior of Cuba, something that was unseen really in Havana history. Farmers came from the villages, came to celebrate these revolutionaries who were going to change agricultural laws, who were going to change the ownership of these massive and profitable sugar plantations, who were going to change the rules of the world and put the farmers on top. Now, one of the symbols of this revolution was the beard. And the beard sort of became almost as iconic for Castro and the revolutionaries as the Green Army fatigues that they wore were. And the reasoning behind the beard was a perfect counter fact, a perfect opposite, a perfect reaction against this clean-shaven suit that was seen in Havana before. So, although Batista is often pictured in his military uniform because he was associated with the military and was a military dictator, many images of Batista show him in a Western suit, as you might expect, some of the trendiest suits that you would see in Havana. Almost everyone was clean-shaven. Perhaps there was a mustache. But these sort of things, shaving, you need a razor, you need a shaving cream, you need time. And the revolutionaries who were training in the jungles of the Sierra Maestra, who were planning on taking Havana, who were planning on creating revolution in Cuba, didn't have time to shave. They didn't have the resources to shave, nor was it a priority. So these guys who are wearing these army fatigues, they probably smelled terrible after months of being in the mountains, fighting a war for years, really. They come to the city, and the beard, this scruffiness, is a symbol of the revolution. And Castro keeps his beard. He never shaves it. He makes various arguments through his interviews. He says at times, well, it saves 15 minutes a day, which, if you add that up, it ends up being an extra 10 days a year for you to do other revolutionary activities. He also says things like, I won't shave my beard off until the revolution is complete. And of course, the revolution's never complete. He dies in 2016, and he dies with the beard on. There's also images of him and Camilo Cienfuegos, another revolutionary, entering that same baseball stadium, La Tropical, renamed Estadio Latino America, wearing jerseys Los Barbudos, the bearded ones. So they play this sort of baseball game for the press, and peasants, farmers are allowed into the stadium, and it's just a total switch. So Havana has been turned upside down. Those who have left, and those who did not have now are having, now arrive. And this shift in the population, this revolution, is by all senses of the word a revolution. It changes Havana, and we have fully transitioned from the dollar of American influence to the bearded revolutionary influence. Now, if you like this Hour of History Cities podcast, you might also like to listen to some of the conversations we have over longer periods about issues like the Sandinistas, who become important in Cuba and Havana's history as well. So please visit hourofhistory.com and check those out. I also like to keep a blog going for some extra discussion about some of the episode topics, where you're encouraged to share, comment, and send us feedback. As usual, if you agree or disagree with anything I say, please let me know, and the purpose of this is to create a discussion. Thanks for listening, and next week we're going to talk about this new revolutionary Cuba and new revolutionary Havana.
Memento, yeah.